to all the environmentalists out there who say that's bullshit, you shouldn't be able to pay someone else to mitigate your carbon, you should do it yourself. I just think that's the stupidest thing in the world. And I don't like that word stupid, but I'm going to use it there because as a business owner, I don't literally take the trash to the dump. I pay someone to do that. We don't ship our products across the ocean because Maersk and other ocean freighters are better at that. We don't make our backpacks because people in Vietnam who own backpack factories are better at doing it. And why would it be different with carbon mitigation?
Hello, friends, and welcome to Impact Everywhere, the podcast that looks for people having a positive impact in unexpected places. Our guest today is Peter Daring, the founder and CEO of Peak Design, as well as the co-founder of Climate Neutral. Peak Design started off as a camera accessory company almost 10 years ago. And since then, they've branched off to include a full suite of bags, travel accessories, and most recently, an entire lineup of mobile phone design products. Their products have raised over $30 million on Kickstarter, but that's not why they're here on this podcast today. They're here today for a couple reasons. First off, because Peter has a very unique way of running Peak Design. It's a value-first company that focuses on employee happiness, which is really interesting. Secondly, he also somehow found the time to co-found an organization called Climate Neutral, which is a nonprofit certification body that, allows you as an organization to offset your carbon footprint. The journey from camera accessory to carbon offsetting is not really one that is linear or predictable. And Peter has such an interesting way of seeing the world that I really wanted to invite him here to talk not only about the philosophy under which he runs Peak Design, but also why he decided to start Climate Neutral and why carbon offsetting is something that he believes every single brand and company should fundamentally get behind. This is Peter Daring, and I've just asked him where he gets his optimism from.
Boy, that's an interesting question. I've spent a lot of my career and time building physical things. For instance, this summer during COVID, I built a whole bunch of just retaining walls and terraces in my backyard and digging literal holes in the earth and pouring concrete and then setting posts and doing that kind of hard physical labor. And I am fortunate enough here in San Francisco to have a view, and I see before me just countless, thousands of buildings that have been erected. And this infrastructure that we have created as humans is just so incredibly robust and so difficult to undo. And I know that we've got a lot of challenges before us right now, but my relentless optimism comes from the relentless improvement that humans tend toward and have always been tending toward. And I say that knowing full well the dangers of climate change, the threat of overpopulation, the concerns of the loss of biodiversity, frickin' viruses, and also people who just want to take the reins of power for the sake of taking power. All these things certainly concern me, but we've always marched on and we've always figured it out. And I look and I'm incredibly inspired by the city that expands before me as much as I am from incredible expanses of nature that similarly are absolute miracles. So there's plenty of good. Just look around.
That's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that answer from anyone before, but it's true. We never really take the time to appreciate how hardworking people can be when they're trying to build up their dreams. What about work ethic? Where do you get your work ethic from? And what is your philosophy around hard work?
I actually think that more often than not, I gravitate toward the type of work that I enjoy doing. And I absolutely avoid the type of work that I don't enjoy doing. Certainly it comes at times when you're starting a business, you've got to wade through the mud at a certain point. You've just got to slog. And fortunately, there's enough on the line there where you'll force yourself to get up and do it. Now, into Peak Design more than 10 years, and we've been fortunate to have had profitable years, every single one, and I have a great team that surrounds me. Not in a nefarious way, just in an efficient way, I avoid the work that I don't want to do, and I do the work that I do want to do. And I think that's critical, is to find a team where all the pieces fit together so that pretty much everyone on the team feels good about what they're doing. That's what makes a great team.
Cool. Speaking of team, you have these 6 really interesting values on which you've built your company that I noticed on your website. Can you walk me through those and tell us all a little bit more about them?
Sure, absolutely. Although there is a phrase that is just above the mission to which you're referring that's called the purpose of Peak Design. And when we were writing the mission of Peak Design, I was actually almost adamant that what we now have as the purpose be the mission, but we ended up compromising. And I'll explain the purpose of Peak Design, which I took from like, when I really dig deep, like, why did I start Peak Design? And I started Peak Design because I wanted a freer, more interesting, happier, more fulfilled life. It was very much about the personal gratification that I would get from my primary occupation. And to me, at no point from 2010 when I started it to 2016, when I think we finally codified the mission, like, that hadn't changed. Like, the reason I was in it was because I'm under the impression we have one life to live, and I would like it to be as interesting as possible. And this was my chosen route toward doing that. And that's the sole reason I did it. I didn't do it to make customers happy. I didn't do it for any other reason than to give myself the best shot at fulfillment. And to me, it's not only very accurate, but it's also very honest and very true. And if someone's going to ask me, what's the purpose of your company? I want that to be as true as possible. The purpose of the company is for the employees of Peak Design to have happy and fulfilled lives. That was palatable to the rest of the team. They're like, okay. They were concerned about it sounding too selfish. And I understand where that concern comes from. No one wants to appear as selfish, but I'd rather be honest than anything else. But what we did was we said, okay, if happiness and fulfillment are what's important, what are the things that we do as a company that give us fulfillment and that give us happiness? And from there, we actually ended up extracting the mission. And that really did resonate with me. And the top core mission is make the best things. Of course, it's trying to say that we make the best of whatever we do, but it's also a governing mechanism to make sure that we don't go too far beyond what our capabilities are. Peak Design can make the best tripod at this point in time. There was a time when we couldn't. Before we had the engineering chops to support that, we could not have made the best tripod, but we grew into that. We can make the best mobile accessories in the world, in my opinion. We couldn't make the best car. There are so many things that we're not equipped to do, but anything that we do enter into, we should enter into with the purpose of being the very best at it. That's number one part of the mission. Number 2 is succeed at the expense of nobody. And this is about fully appreciating that, there's 40 people roughly that work for Peak Design as employees. But the vast majority of people who actually are doing the work for Peak Design are in Vietnam and China, and they are doing hard manual labor in order to produce the goods that we sell. Certainly, I believe in free markets and global trade. And what this says, though, is that we care about the lives of the people who are making our products as well, and we want them to have an equal shot at happiness and fulfillment. That's the second part of the mission. Let's see here. Coming up next, treat our customers as peers. That comes from the fact that really this has like roots to Kickstarter, in that we have a very concerted two-way conversation between our customers, and our customers are smart. They have a lot of great ideas, and it's about always incorporating them into our design process and being extremely gracious with them in terms of customer service. Treat them like your friend. I think it's critically important, and I think it is absolutely rubbed off. And that also, a big part of that is like making sure that I personally remain open to having conversations with anyone in our customer set who wants to talk with me. I literally put my email address saying send me a note at the bottom of every customer email that we send out. And fortunately, I don't get 100 emails a day, but I get quite a few emails from customers, and I answer every single one of them. So, important part of it. 4 is offset our environmental impact. And this is a major one. And I think the key word there is offset, Because let's face it, if you're going to be a participant in today's economy, that means that you're going to be doing a number of bad things for the environment. But the one that's most critical is you're going to be responsible for fossil fuel consumption. And there is not currently a way around that until our systems and manufacturing are deeply electrified and until that electricity is coming from renewable sources. You're going to have an impact. And the least you can do, it's also the most you can do in a way, is you can offset that environmental impact. So we're very keen to do that. The next one is use our voice to inspire positive change. And that was almost thrown in last minute because I actually can't even recall what the specific issue of the day was, but there are simply issues that come up in our time as citizens of this country and of this planet that are important to us, that we feel the desire to speak out about. We know that we have a platform and we wanted to grant ourselves the license to talk about, I don't know, women's rights or something that has very little to do with camera accessories, but we still feel is important in this world. So that's why we put that in there. And the last one is to prioritize happiness over growth. And this is a critical one because it makes sure that I, as the owner of the company, keep my focus on the happiness and welfare of my employees, and that we don't go and chase the dreams of the Silicon Valley riches that I think a lot of companies do end up chasing, in part because they have to, because they sold a part of their company early on to either a growth equity fund or to venture capital. They get involved in that spin cycle. And because of Kickstarter, Peak Design has been fortunate to be able to avoid going that investor route. And so prioritizing happiness over growth is part and parcel to who we are.
I want to ask a question about number 6 specifically. Then, as like the second most funded company on Kickstarter, you must be approached all the time by people who say, oh, you could grow faster, bigger, larger, and you can retain dominant control over everything. And your employees could even get bigger bonuses, and whatever. I'm sure there's a lot of offers that come on the table. Do you think that growth is a direct threat to happiness, or is it something different?
I think certainly is not guaranteed to be that. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who have grown companies more rapidly than I have that have maintained happiness. But I think here's the trouble that you get yourself into is if I were to sell a chunk of this company to an equity investing firm, they would make me a rich man, that's for sure. But their expectation would be that in either 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, that they expect 4x return or something like that. And if you don't produce that, they would have penalties. And besides that, like you just have people who are upset with you. And right now, I don't have that. And no one at the company has these expectations of performance that end up creating stress in lives, right? Driving timelines. Life gets bad. And I'm not saying this doesn't happen at all at Peak Design, because we are ambitious and we do try to get products out in reasonable amounts of time. But that's when things get ugly, is when timelines get crunched. And when there's that forcing function of like, yeah, but the board meeting's coming up next month. Come on, Tom, I got to have these things done. I do. And then Tom's end up spending late nights and having a bad relationship with his wife, and no one's paying attention to the kids. And that is the spiral. I really do think it's the beginning of the spiral, and it would be culture changing. And I just don't want it.
I love that. That's super interesting. It's almost like saying growth is not an important metric, or it's pretty low down on the priority. It's low enough to not even make it onto the list of values. So why bother inviting that into the equation in the first place? Really interesting.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of running a value-first company from a pure business perspective?
Employee attraction and retention. When we put out a job application or have a job ready, the people who flock toward it are incredible. They really are. And in the history of Peak Design, we've only had one person leave. And that type of continuity just makes it so much easier to run a business. All of not only the lore, but the history, it's all just retained. And you don't have to transfer that knowledge, and it doesn't get lost. And I'd say that's the biggest benefit of running a values-based corporation, is that people stick around.
That's great. Let's shift the focus a little bit outwards in terms of the impact that you're having on the world, even from either a problem-solving perspective or an environmental perspective. It seems like your definition of impact might be changing over time, and it also definitely has multiple layers to it. So I'm curious to know, what is your theory of change, and how do you think business can be a force for good?
The theory of change is in some ways dead simple. One, I focus almost exclusively on carbon and or climate change. A lot of people like to focus on like end of life of things like, oh my gosh, your products will end up in a landfill, or these plastic straws will end up in a landfill. Listen, folks, we're not running out of landfill. This is not an existential threat. As good as WALL-E was as a movie, really it was, like this is not the problem right now. And all the existential threats like loss of biodiversity, these things all emanate from the threat of climate change. And all of those end up laddering up to carbon. Even things like localized pollution, like, yeah, you don't want to make your products in a factory that poisons a local water supply or is detrimental to the health of the people around it. Those things should be table stakes. They really should. Like, of course, you don't want to do that. And of course, we choose factories that are doing right by the environment. But the thing that companies have not chosen to take on hard enough, in my opinion, even close, is climate. And the fact that every dollar of commerce has linked to it a certain amount of fossil fuel burn. And we've all been skating by for free, just not paying for this obvious negative externality. And the amazing thing is that look at Romer and Nordhaus. These are the Nobel Prize winning economists who basically did a bunch of work on saying, here's how much it will cost to fix climate change. And their estimates are that it will cost 2 to 3% of gross world product every single year. Basically, the world makes about $100 trillion. And we need to spend $2 to $3 trillion annually on carbon mitigation, whether those are carbon removals, whether it's the acceleration of switching to renewables, just broadly speaking, carbon mitigation, 2 to 3%. That's not that bad. It's really not. We're not talking about the cessation of free markets or capitalism when we're talking about fixing climate change. We're talking about digging into our pockets and paying for a negative externality that it's material, but it's not that much. And the way that Peak Design has stumbled into this is by asking the question back in 2018, what is our carbon footprint and how much would it cost to offset it? And when we asked those questions, we got some response on the $30 million of revenue we did in 2017. It's about 20,000 tons of CO2, which is basically an esoteric number. That means nothing to me. I don't know what 20,000 tons looks like in the sky. I don't know anything about it. But what's interesting is that eradicating it through carbon offsets cost at the time about $60,000, $3 a ton, $3 per ton. It was remarkable to me that it was that affordable to do it because we had already committed to spending 1% of our sales on environmental nonprofits. So for just 1/5 of 1%, we could eradicate our carbon footprint via the carbon offset mechanism. Now, the world that Romer and Nordhaus talk about, where we're spending 2 to 3% on carbon removals, is not the world we live in today. And in part, that's because carbon mitigation can still be performed much more cheaply because there's lots of low-hanging fruit out there. Easy nature-based solutions that aren't very costly that allow us to get at carbon mitigation. If every business in the world were to say, gosh, you know what? Maybe we should pay to remove our carbon from the atmosphere. You would obviously have a massive demand for carbon offsets. The existing supply wouldn't be able to support it, and the price would go up rather rapidly. And if you keep in mind, Peak Design initially paid 1/5 of 1% to remove all our carbon. And the economists suggest that it's going to be 2 to 3% total. That means a price increase of 10 to 15 times as much. It's still something, Ben, that I would be very willing to pay as a business owner. And perhaps that's because we're on the more, I don't want to say altruistic, because I don't think that's where it comes from necessarily. Call it progressive side of business. But This is why we need either customers or governments to demand of businesses that they start paying for their mitigation.
I really like it when you boil things down into an economical model. It almost feels totally manageable of a problem as opposed to the whole climate change doom and gloom normal conversation that we sort of get caught up in. The $60,000 for $30 million of revenue, as an example, is just so cheap. I mean, I can't get over how cheap it is. And when you look at the numbers in that way, it just feels so achievable. That being said, carbon offsetting is not something that all environmentalists really get behind. What do you say to your detractors that say that carbon offsetting is not the solution?
To all the environmentalists out there who say, that's bullshit. You shouldn't be able to just pay for your sins. You shouldn't be able to pay someone else to mitigate your carbon. You should do it yourself. I just think that's the stupidest thing in the world. And I don't like that word stupid, but I'm going to use it there because as a business owner, I don't literally take the trash to the dump. I pay someone to do that. We don't ship our products across the ocean because Maersk and other ocean freighters are better at that. We don't make our backpacks because people in Vietnam who own backpack factories are better at doing it. And why would it be different with carbon mitigation? I set out to be a design company that designs camera accessories. Why am I supposed to be an expert in carbon mitigation? Now I have to put that on my list of talents? No way. That's not scalable. That's ridiculous. And so this whole notion that you shouldn't be allowed to pay for removing your carbon, that you should somehow inherently do it yourself, is completely idiotic. It's completely out of touch with what we do with every other aspect of business. There has been a lot of hollering from the far-reaching aspects of the environmental groups that say, you shouldn't pay for it, you should just stop doing it. And I'm afraid that stopping commerce would be so much more detrimental to the world than climate change, right? The bad aspect like war and famine and all these things that we fear with climate change are going to happen only in a much more acute timescale. So it's just not realistic that we are going to stop the economy.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Those are some really solid arguments and really hard to argue against. One of the things that Climate Neutral is advocating for is making sure that we calculate not just Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but also Scope 3 emissions. Do you think you could break it down for the listeners on what these three different scopes are?
Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. That's the going vernacular for how you bucket these things. And Scope 1 is, if you're a business, it's like the literal hydrocarbons that you burn as a business. Peak Design occasionally brews beer, and we burn a little bit of propane doing that. But our Scope 1 emissions, other than that, are next to nothing. So, because we don't have a factory where we are creating any industrial processes. Our Scope 2 emissions are essentially, almost all of Scope 2 emissions are purchased electricity. So we use the electricity in our office and in our homes as we go about our work. But the emissions are being created offsite at PG&E's various power generation stations. So our Scope 2 footprint, it doesn't take a lot to run our office in San Francisco. We've got LED lights and it's a mild climate. So there's just not a lot of spend going on there. Then Scope 3 is everything upstream, downstream that you're not like directly emitting. So that in our case is, let's take making a backpack. So our backpacks are made of a nylon poly blend. Both of those are petrochemicals. At this point, it's all recycled materials. But if you were to chase that thing all the way back, I guess you'd start at the point of collection of a recycled product, whether that's water bottles or fishing nets or whatever it may be. Then there's the mechanical component of recycling. Then there's the heat-based component, a bunch of motors spinning around, chopping stuff up. Then there's the heat that goes into processing that and making it into pellets. And then there's another heat and pressing process that goes into winding these into filaments. And then there's the weaving process. And then there's the dyeing process. And then there's the coating process. And these are 10 different factories so far. All of these things have energy components to them, all of them. And those represent Scope 1 footprints for each of those factories. But it would be really disingenuous of me as a company to say, oh, that's not my responsibility, the conversion of that recycled material to fabric. That's on them. That would be really irresponsible of me to do that because they're producing fabric for Peak Design bags, which of course are eventually going to get cut and sewn into assemblies and shipped all over the world and packaged and then used by consumers. The premise of climate neutral was to make very clear boundaries around carbon responsibility. Brands need to be responsible for the carbon it takes to make and deliver their products. And assigning responsibility to the ocean freighter line that's carrying our bags across the sea, that's baloney, man. Like, they are simply providing a service. They're fulfilling the supply for the demand that's created by the Peak Designs, the Patagonias, the Targets and the Walgreens and the Walmarts of the world, right? They are a commodity player in this chain that is satisfying brands. And so in terms of physical goods, if you're not taking care of your scope 3 carbon and you're trying to give yourself accolades for having offset or reduced or eliminated your scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint, in my view, you're a charlatan. And that's what a lot of companies were trying to claim is that, oh, we're carbon neutral, scope 1 and scope 2. Or actually, they just usually say we're carbon neutral. And then when you dig in, you find out that it's just their scope 1 and scope 2. And to me, that's precisely the type of greenwashing that forces such a backward step in our march for progress here. Because not every single human has the time to invest to understand what's the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And so that's part of the reason why climate neutral was created. It was to have this label that is very clearly black and white. Did you pay for all your carbon or didn't you?
Prior to climate neutral coming along, what were the existing certification bodies that existed and why were they insufficient?
I think one reason that they were insufficient is because they weren't readily apparent. In my first round of internet research to find this certification body, it did not come up. Eventually, we did find one. I think the most notable one is something called Certified Carbon Neutral, using the Carbon Neutral Protocol, run by a company that's based both here and in London called Natural Capital Partners. Natural Capital Partners is a for-profit institution that helps companies offset their footprint. They develop offset projects. They created this certification to make sure you're measuring the full amount. As to why it didn't become popular, one reason, I think, is because the certification is owned by this for-profit company, Natural Capital Partners, and it's very biased toward using them as the consultancy. So it's not this open source thing where you can acquire your offsets from any location. It has this kind of for-profit element. It's just not suited to be the broad certification for everyone. And the other problem, I think, is just that it actually was too technical, too complicated, specifically because on the measurement piece, it is absolutely impossible to perfectly measure one's carbon footprint, but it's not that difficult to get a pretty good ballpark. However, in order to avoid certain levels of scrutiny, people have over-indexed on, okay, the measurement must be perfect, because if it's not perfect and if we can't prove it, then people are going to call bullshit. That forces a lot of extra work in trying to ascertain more perfect carbon footprints, when really it's just, we're never going to know perfectly precisely. Get in the ballpark, round up a little bit, and have some science behind what dictates what your ballpark is.
And from a public perception perspective, no one's ever going to complain that people are rounding up their carbon footprint.
Exactly. Right.
Just saying,
exactly.
Hey, we're just going to pay a little bit more because just in case.
Yeah. It's a pretty easy way to solve a problem versus, okay, let's go deeper and deeper into carbon accounting. That is not easy. It's not easy. Rounding up is easy.
So walk me through the process of how so you said they measured, I don't know, was it 20,000 tons of CO2 in your case, and they still needed $30,000 to make it more specific. What is the process that Climate Neutral has put into place, and how quick is it as opposed to, say, industry standard prior to you guys coming along?
The process we put in place is we are taking a data set of emissions factors for an incredibly wide array of physical products. For instance, there will be an emissions factor for a use per kilogram of polyethylene, both short chain, long chain, and recycled. Like you pick which one of those you're using, and you can either choose by weight or by dollars. And this is critical because all of this information is actually really readily available in companies' accounting if you can divvy it up by dollars. So by having economic inputs into the equation of how much did you spend on low carbon steel? How much did you spend on stainless steels? You can fairly quickly ascertain a excellent approximation of your carbon footprint. So we created a software tool called the B, the Brand Emissions Estimator, which is totally free up to a certain point. If you know your company's financials and what products are made out of, you'll be able to get a good first pass for free. And then if you care to dive deeper, at that point, you start talking to us and hopefully get on the path toward pursuing certification.
Got it. But what's the reason for having the manual piece? Like, why not have a full calculator out there that could automate the entire process?
There's a lot of complex calculations that are happening in the background there. It's the inputs. And we've actually been in deep talks with Intuit and Salesforce as well. You really need to hook into accounting platforms if you're wishing to extract this data without any kind of secondary means of input. Because they're not essentially set up to have this expectation of accounting for carbon, I think that will change in the future. And we'll see if that integration happens with the B specifically, or if there's going to be it seems to be there's a bunch of private software flocking toward that. So we'll find out.
Oh man, that whole software integration piece is super exciting because I think that so much of people not wanting to get involved with the climate problem is just the complexity of it. And when you reduce that complexity, so much more is possible. So fingers crossed for you. You know, I find it so interesting that you've basically pivoted from a company that makes camera accessories to a company that makes general accessories into now co-founding a brand new nonprofit that is going to act as a certification body. On paper, these are two very different companies. So I just want to hear from you. How do you think your experience at Peak Design has helped you become more successful at climate neutral?
Interesting question, because they're definitely very different things. In so many ways, climate neutral is such a bigger idea. It's grandiose. If it's truly going to be successful, we need so many businesses to sign up to start making a real dent in the carbon markets. Maybe the greatest kind of transference of abilities is confidence. Peak Design and the success of Peak Design gave me confidence. And I think it took a lot of that to co-found Climate Neutral. And of course, the platform as well, being able to lean on our existing customers to rally them to say, hey, if this thing's going to take flight, you're the people we know. We need you to get behind this as well. And they really did that. I'd say those two elements.
Do you think you would have been able to do Climate Neutral without the prior success of Peak Design behind you?
No, I'm afraid not. And it's not to say that grassroots movements are started all the time on their own. Put it this way, it certainly was an accelerant. You look at it right now today, and Climate Neutral is the world's largest certification body for full entity carbon neutrality. And that's in 2 years' time, less than 2 years' time. It could not have gone that fast if it weren't for Peak Design. If it would have been my whole mission in life, maybe I would have got there at some point, but it would have been a very different journey.
I hear you. Let's take the time to talk a little bit about your Peak Design journey, because I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about this whole climate neutral part, which is fairly recent, but you basically built Peak Design from the ground up. And I, prior to this interview, decided to watch your first marketing video, and I realized I had never seen the first video, which is hilarious. But anyways, do you want to just talk about that real quick and share with the listeners?
Why don't you talk about it? Why don't you tell me what you thought about that first video?
You look so young.
I was so young.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the video, I think there's a part of me that just goes like, wow, is that it? Because so much has changed. And your videos these days are so slick. It's crazy to look back and see like, wow, is that all it took to get to where you are today? I don't know. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, man. I, of course, turned on that video and there's a certain component of it that makes me squirm because it's embarrassing, because it's cheesy and dorky and so poorly produced compared to what we do now. But on the other hand, I'm very proud of it too, because it worked. I was able to convince 5,208 people that this was a great idea and it was worth parting with $50 for. And it absolutely changed my life, that first Kickstarter. What a magical time. The dollars literally just start coming in. It was so special, man. A really cool thing about Kickstarter is that it took that very classic sort of American dream, if you will. I don't know how necessarily just American it is. I'm sure it's the world around, but of entrepreneurship, starting something from scratch. And it put a literal ticker to it where you could count the dollars come in and watch, oh my God, this is the idea turning into success right before my very eyes. And seeing that point where, holy smokes, I've broken even. Oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to pay for this new kid who's about to be born in a couple of months, which was a pretty wild thing that I had a kid during that first Kickstarter campaign. It was magical. I had no idea at the time that it would become essentially the formula that we'd sit there and repeat for 10 years now, which is launch a Kickstarter every single year. But that's what we've done. And I don't pretend to be some business mastermind. We have found a formula, we have stuck to it, and we have, I think, appropriately increased our own capabilities, our own complexity each and every year. And as a result, the suite of products that we are able to put out falls within the bounds of make the best thing, continues to improve every single year. And in this world, I think humans derive enjoyment through improvement. So that's what keeps it fresh and fun.
You just mentioned formula, and I'm sure you get this question all the time, but I have to ask it anyways. What is the formula to create a successful Kickstarter from someone who's done it 10 times and has raised over $30 million on the platform?
Make sure you solve real problems, first and foremost. If your products are solving problems for which there isn't a big enough market, or for which you are exaggerating the magnitude of the problem in your own head, which I think a lot of designers fall into, or if you're solving problems that have already been well solved by many other good products, you're simply going to struggle. As you grow and mature as a company, you can fall back a little bit more on brand. Brand is a very powerful element that you don't have as a young company, but Peak Design certainly has a strong brand considering our size and age. And we are able to rely on that a little bit more just to give our customers a little bit of a preconceived notion about what they're going to be getting when they get the next Peak Design product. So that formula does mature every single year, but fortunately, we've got a product roadmap that has quite a bit of depth to it. We've got years of products in front of us that we know our customers are going to be excited about. And so, I don't know, having a great product roadmap is something that gives me a lot of comfort.
Well, I got to say, Peter, as a customer of yours, I absolutely love your roadmap, and I get super excited every time there's a new Peak Design announcement. And especially your latest Kickstarter, which is Peak Design for mobile, making these high quality mobile accessories that are phenomenally delightful, especially that tripod for the phone, which sounds dorky, but man, now that I have it, I just know that I can't live without it. But anyways, even more exciting than your products, I think, is this new secondary marketplace that you are developing. Do you think you can share with the listeners a little bit more about that?
The timing couldn't be better because we're about to launch into mobile phone products. And the last thing we want is for this suite of accessories to be put in the bin with other, like what traditionally mobile accessories have been, which is just this kind of throwaway, use it for a little bit and then it's done. We've made a really concerted effort, and it's not that easy, but to put a serial number on everything that we make and to individualize it. And even to give it a QR code so that each product that we make, including each mobile accessory that we make, is traceable and trackable. We know when it was made, we know where it's been shipped to and from. And by giving it that uniqueness, I think it creates more value for each individual customer. And one of the ways that we are intending to release in the very near future here is a peer-to-peer marketplace. So that means that when you go to peakdesign.com, it'll be like a different section of the website, but it'll be very abundantly clear that don't want to buy this 6-liter sling new, buy a certified used one. And then you'll go over to the Peak Design peer-to-peer marketplace. And inevitably, there will be people who are willing to part with their used gear. There will be individual photographs for it. And Peak Design is never going to receive and intake that product and then redistribute it. Rather, we'll set up the shipping and everything and make it as slick as possible. But that individual is going to send it to another individual. And Peak Design is essentially brokering the sale and making sure that the product is quality along the way and making sure that both parties are satisfied with the transaction. Certainly used marketplaces exist. eBay has been crushing it for however long. But to do that on our own website and to do it without having to bring it into a centralized Peak Design warehouse where it has one extra shipment, one extra cardboard box, one extra piece of handling that goes through it. I think that in my mind, the end result will be if you buy a $600 carbon fiber tripod from us, these things hold their retail value. And you should be able to sell that thing in a few years' time for $500. Instead of buying something that is an expense, it's more like you're acquiring an asset. And I think you're going to be able to do this not just for a $600 tripod, but for a $40 cell phone case as well. So that's a dream. And there's a reason why we put a lifetime warranty on our products. They should last a long time. They'll get worn, they'll get beat up. Sure, you can't stop that, but they're still useful. And I'm very excited about this program.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I mean, you're essentially building circularity into everything that you do. And the carbon cost of manufacturing a new thing is so much higher than just getting people to reuse something. And I guess to bring this back to what we had said earlier, if you were trying to do this with multiple shareholders in play, they'd be like, what are you doing? This is going to cut into our bottom line. But I don't even necessarily think that's going to be the case. If anything, if I knew that I could buy something right now and I could retrieve most of its value back in the future easily and conveniently, I'd probably buy it quicker. So I really love that you are experimenting with that. Has this ever been done anywhere else? Has anyone successfully pioneered this? Because I haven't heard of it anywhere.
I don't think so. And what's incredible is that I met this dude named Wilson Griffin. He worked in sustainability at Gap. I was trying to get Gap to join Climate Neutral, Gap Inc. They haven't yet, but I got to know him through that. And I had told him about my idea for a peer-to-peer marketplace. And what was remarkable is that he had a very similar idea. And he ended up leaving and linking up with a business partner, genuinely pursuing the idea. And we are now utilizing their technology platform, and we're essentially their first customer. So their company is called Recurate, and we're going to be probably the first company to officially launch with it, Recurate. Fun story about how it all came together. My team makes fun of me. They wanted to call this section of the website Trader Pete's, because it's another thing that I've just been championing so long. And they're a little bit skeptical about how it's going to go. And who knows, it might not be huge, but it would be amazing if it could become a core part of the way that Peak Design does business. And then, of course, if it can scale through Recurate's utilization of a platform, that's nothing but good for the world and good for the consumer.
I've had a number of these conversations with people, and I generally leave them feeling split between whether capitalism is going to destroy the world and if these kind of capitalism and sustainability can truly coexist. But I think hearing how your learnings and this constant drive for innovation and improvement on how can we just make us as humans better is something that I just gives me so much hope and optimism in the whole thing. So thank you for that. Alrighty. Last question then. If you had a microphone to the world and you had one thing to say, what would that thing be?
All businesses should offset the carbon it takes to make and ship their products.
Awesome, man. And if people want to follow you and all that good stuff, where should they go to stock all the good things that you guys are doing?
Oh man, probably don't go to my social media. It's infrequent, but I'm on Instagram, Peter Daring, not too hard to find. But I recommend following the Peak Design Instagram. That's a laugh a minute. So come on over there and actually sign up for our YouTube as well. We've got some hilarious cats, and I think our YouTube videos are worth checking out.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate you.
All righty, folks. There you have it. That was Peter Daring, the CEO and founder of Peak Design, as well as a co-founder of climateneutral.org. If you want to go check out their latest Kickstarter, It's ending in just a couple days, so I would highly recommend you go check it out. I've received a set of pre-production units of their latest mobile phone products, and just little plug there. They're really, really great and well built, and they're super, super sexy. With regards to climateneutral.org, if you work at a company that may be interested in offsetting their carbon footprint, make sure to sign them up, send them to the website. It's an amazing initiative that anyone can get involved in. And like Peter said, it really doesn't cost a lot of money to offset your carbon footprint. I've already sent it off to a bunch of friends in the corporate world, and hopefully some of them will sign up. If you guys are looking for show notes, links, or summary, you can always head over to impacteverywhere.org. Write me an email at hi@impacteverywhere.org if you have any guest recommendations or any feedback. And as always, if you're having a great time and you like what you hear, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference. That's it for this week, folks. I hope you're enjoying it so far. See you guys around next week, and stay positive, because impact is everywhere.